Right, thank you. So thank you so much, Lana and the colleagues for inviting me to speak here tonight. And also thank you, Ksenia, for making this introduction. As Ksenia mentioned, the magazine, the Russian English version of the magazine, available somewhere around the bar. Right, okay, so you can see it now. And you're welcome to take one copy. Thank you. It's also available freely online. Yeah, you can read it online as well. So as I mentioned, actually less than a week ago, I came from Egypt, Sharm el-Sheikh, where another session of the United Nations climate negotiations took place, the so-called COP27, which is the UN Climate Conference 27. And I'll probably start with that because that's the most recent and very important global climate event. And I'll say very briefly what the conference was about and also how the war in Ukraine and its climate consequences were spoken of and represented in the conference. And then I'll also speak about what's actually happening within Ukrainian and Russian climate agenda. And then, well, I kind of know and I see there are quite a few other environmental and climate specialists, also experts in the area of sustainability, originally from Russia, now based in the Netherlands, also here. So I'll be happy to hear their questions. I'll be also happy to hear your questions and your reactions. And I very much hope for a very interesting discussion. And so the UN Climate Conference. So what is it that brings 35,000 people together? That's quite a lot of people. There's actually, normally there's a lot of criticism. Why so many people fly to one place, eat a lot of food, throw away a lot of packaging, use a lot of energy for air conditioning, well, which was the case in Egypt, or heating, if it were somewhere in northern location, to come up with zero results. So that's the criticism which you get of the UN Climate Conferences. And such a conference takes place usually once every year, normally around November, December. That's the largest climate event of the year. And throughout the year, there are also regular consultations, like more technical consultations, which usually take place in Bonn in Germany. This is where the UN Climate Secretariat is based. So, who are these 35,000 people, and what the whole discussion was about? I think if you're a bit outside of the whole climate community and climate debate, you might think that those are mostly scientists getting together to talk about climate change. No, it is not so completely. Those are mostly politicians, other experts, companies, businesses, lawyers, people from the civil society sector, and journalists. And the things they talk about mostly are political measures, commitments, so pledges, like what is our goal to reduce greenhouse gas emission in a particular country or in a particular region, and money. There's a lot of talk about money in various formats. Climate finance it is called, and it can come in various forms, in various tracks. And I would say, like, one of the main focuses at the UN climate negotiations is about money. What kind of tracks of financing are available, who is paying money to whom, through which programs, how it is transparent, how it is accountable, how it is verifiable, what kind of results we get. So, there's a lot of talk about money, and there's also a lot of talk about technology. So money flows, technology transfer, and political pledges, political promises, and political measures. And in a way, because this UN Climate Conference was taking place in Egypt, which is geographically speaking Africa, this particular conference had a very strong focus on Africa as a continent. And we understand that well, on one hand, there's still something which is called energy poverty in Africa. So, like many hundreds of millions of people don't have access to any energy. So that's like question number one. On the other hand, Africa is one of the growing continents, both in terms of population, but also in terms of economies. And it's quite obvious that there will be more need for energy. And there's a lot of expectation that Africa as a continent, as well as many other parts of the world which do not currently have energy or have issues with access to stable energy supplies, will do something which is in economic terms and in climate terms called leapfrogging. So they will not repeat the path which many European countries did. That is first go into fossil fuels, and then after that go in straight away to renewable energy. But the dream is that many countries from Africa will leapfrog straight away to the renewable energy from energy board. This is one dream, but then there's also something which is a reality. And a reality of what currently happening in Africa actually has to do a lot with one of the consequences of the war in Ukraine. Surprisingly, you may think, okay, where's Ukraine, where's Africa? And you all probably heard about the whole food security debate that was covered in the news. Wheat supplies, other grain supplies, also fertilizer supplies from Russia, from Ukraine, from Belarus have been disrupted, and that was very worrying from many countries in Africa and also other regions of the world. But there's another consequence, and that consequence is the energy market. The war in Ukraine led to sanctions against Russia and against Russia's supply of fossil fuels. And that, in a very indirect way, led to the fact that many other countries started thinking, okay, then maybe we can actually explore and produce more fossil fuel because there are gaps in the market which we can substitute. And this is what we also see in the case of Africa. Many European oil and gas companies are actually trying to come to Africa now and invest into gas production. So at the UN Climate Conference in Egypt, there were a lot of campaigns which were saying, don't gas Africa. Like, don't use our territory for supplying gas to Europe. Because this is the new neo-colonialism. This is also something which will be stranded assets. So the assets will be built, but they will not really be needed in 20 to 30 years. What we needed is renewable energy and mine for renewable energy. So there was this debate, which is probably one of the first indirect connections to the war in Ukraine, of which there were many. And I will speak more specifically about that just in a minute. But to wrap up what the summit was about and what the results of the summit were, as I mentioned, one big track of discussions and negotiations is about money. And so the good news from the summit, which there were actually very few good news, but one of the good news, is that there was a new financial track established, and that financial track is called loss and damage. Now, if we speak about the whole bag of climate finance, it usually goes into something which is called climate mitigation, meaning decreasing greenhouse gases or producing less greenhouse gases, or climate adaptation, which means adapting to consequences of climate change, which are either already there with us or which are planned for the next 10 years, 50 years, 100 years. But then there's also something which is called loss and damage. And that means we have to acknowledge, and this is a very sad truth, that we will lose something forever because of climate change. There can be coral reefs, there can be islands, there can be ecosystems. Some forests can burn and they will not grow again. Some species will die. Some cities will be destroyed. A lot of infrastructure will be destroyed. So the question is, who is paying for it? And that question was in the middle of climate negotiations for many years. I mean, there are various estimations. One estimation says for 30 years. Well, not 30 because it's COP27, so it's been happening for 27 years actually. And the most recent point we can refer to is 2013 in Warsaw, when the whole mechanism was established. And here's once again you see this huge collision between developing and developed countries. Well, it's a so-called developing and so-called developed. I don't quite like the whole division. Because a lot of the global south countries are saying, look, it's you, the global north countries, who have caused a lot of climate pollution and greenhouse gas emissions, so you're responsible. You're also responsible for paying for the climate damage which mostly we at the global south are experiencing. And so there was a lot of negotiations about establishing this new track. Finally, they did it. It is there, it is with us. Now, the way it functions, countries, as well as with all the other tracks, they are paid voluntarily into climate finance banks, so to say. And then other countries can apply for this money. And in this case of this loss and damage track, only the most vulnerable countries to climate change can apply, and also the countries who don't have the resources to adapt or to pay for it themselves. Since we're in the Netherlands, there's a very popular example which often comes up in the climate negotiations. Netherlands is also very vulnerable to climate change, as you know, especially if you think about how low the land here is in comparison to the sea level. But then, throughout centuries, Netherlands have got a lot of expertise and knowledge how to protect its communities, its economy, its infrastructure from the floods and from the increase in sea level. If you look at a country like Bangladesh, which I think would be surprising to many visitors coming from Russia, whenever I mention this fact, there's usually a lot of amusement. Bangladesh population is actually larger than Russia. If you take a look at the map, it's a very small country, about 160 million people live there. So Bangladesh also has 1/3 of its area below the sea level, and various negative consequences because of the rising sea level, from floods to salination of fresh water and salination of soils, which has a long-running effect. Once again, the ability of Bangladesh to adapt to climate change and to withstand climate change is much lower than the ability of the Netherlands. And that's an example which is very often mentioned at the climate level. So we have this track and we have this opportunity, and hopefully it will help some countries, and it will help the most poor countries and most vulnerable countries. So that was the main achievement, and it was actually, I would say, probably was one of the very few achievements. Now, what is it that the summit didn't reach? There's usually a lot of expectation that whenever countries get together, they will raise up their climate ambition. They will raise up their climate pledges, saying we will cut our emissions much more than we promised before. Now, that didn't happen, unfortunately. And just to give you a very, once again, brief picture, as you might know, the global agreement which we have now is the Paris Climate Agreement, and in the Paris Climate Agreement, it is said that all countries are trying their best to keep the global rise in the temperature within 2 degrees Celsius and aiming for 1.5 degrees Celsius. Rise since the beginning of the industrial era, which is the late 18th century, to now later. Now, where are we now? We are already now around plus 1.1 degrees Celsius. And if we take up all climate commitments of all the countries in the last few years and also now, we're probably moving somewhere around plus 2.73 degrees. Now, if there were no climate negotiations and also 35,000 people didn't come to Sharm el-Sheikh, and we're not talking for 2 weeks, the world would probably be on a track between 4 and 5 degrees. So that would be the business as usual track. So unfortunately, and we see it year after year, the whole process, the way it's structured now, it does not really motivate countries to come up with more ambitious climate targets and say we're willing and we're able to reduce even more. And this is something which makes a lot of people puzzled and a lot of people sad. But this is where we are at the moment. Now, going slowly into the main topic of our discussion, and that is the influence of the war in Ukraine and all of this. The question which I get asked a lot is how the war in Ukraine was represented and spoken about at the UN Climate Summit. It was present. It was not officially part of the agenda because the UN is trying to remain neutral no matter what other wars or military conflicts are out there, and this is also a space where both, say, Russia and Ukraine, Armenia and Azerbaijan, Israel and Palestine, many other countries, they just get together and speak to each other. And so this is why it's very important for the UN to keep it neutral. But even though it was not part of the official agenda, it was still something which I would say was almost like an elephant in the room. Everyone was directly or indirectly speaking about it, and mentioning it, and also saying the way the war has influence on climate agenda, on energy agenda, on food agenda. So, as I already said, both delegations of Russia and Ukraine were present. Ukraine actually had a very special pavilion, where every day it had a few events and was talking a lot about environmental consequences of the war, climate consequences of the war. The Russian many studies presented, also the ones which estimated extra greenhouse gas emissions because of the war. And in these studies, what is usually calculated is the amount of greenhouse gas emissions because of the weapons and all of the arms which have been used in military action, including transportation. Also, all the emissions resulting from destruction of urban infrastructure, urban and military infrastructure, civil and military infrastructure. Also, all the emissions because of the burning forests. And many forests have burned in Ukraine since the beginning of the war. Also, all the emissions because people had to move, and millions of people had to move within the country or out of the country. And finally, also all the emissions which will be needed to restore Ukraine and to rebuild the cities again. We understand it's difficult to speak about that now because the war is still going. Actually, as we see it here, the war is still going on. So many of these emissions were still estimations, but it was still presented. And Ukraine spoke a lot about it. So this is once again something which can be called the direct consequence of the war. Direct, immediate, also something visible. And actually in the magazine which I already spoke about, we have a very, I think, good and very well-researched article by an Ukrainian environmentalist, Alexei Vasylyuk, who's actually been monitoring land pollution, water pollution, air pollution, destruction of ecosystems because of the war. And he and his fellow colleagues have been monitoring and making maps and also analyzing satellite imagery in trying to trace the immediate consequences of the war, just in Ukraine, on the land, in water, in the forest, in the steppes. So, as I said, this was one level, and that was also highly represented and spoken about at the UN Climate Conference in Egypt. But then there was also something which I already mentioned in the beginning, and those were the rather indirect consequences of the war in Ukraine. And that is changing importance of the climate agenda, changing energy market, which is now in the big turmoil, and long-standing effects on other sectors, including food sector or metal sector, many other sectors. Now, if you speak about climate agenda, the war in Ukraine influenced in a number of ways. One of that was that many countries and media also as well started paying somewhat less attention to the climate change and climate crisis because so much attention is being given to the war in Ukraine now. Then the second consequence is that a lot of money is now being redistributed to weapons in one way or another. And obviously that money is also being taken off from climate finance, the one I was speaking about earlier. But if we speak about energy market, the whole restructuring of energy market is also dramatic. Because of the sanctions against Russian oil, coal, and gas, but also many other trends, as we heard in the case of Africa. So to put it in a very simple picture, sanctions against Russian coal, oil, and partly gas led to the fact that European and North American customers started buying less or no Russian fossil fuel, depends on the country. At the same time, Russia started selling more of its oil and coal to other parts of the world, including Asia. And China, India, Egypt, and Turkey began buying much more Russian coal and oil. And because oil is a very tricky product to trace, we also saw that some of these countries began reselling this oil to European customers, which is also makes the whole system kind of crazy. And Russia is selling its oil to Asia with a serious discount of 25 to 30% cheaper than to European customers. And some of these countries, as I already mentioned, they resell it to Europe with a higher price. So it's crazy. It's oil and coal are relatively easy to transport. You can transport it with railways, with tankers, with other vessels, container, in case of coal, so other kinds of vessels. Gas is a bit of more of a complicated story. So natural gas, you need a lot of infrastructure, either pipelines, and you know what happened with Nord Stream 1 and Nord Stream 2, or you also need LNG terminals, so liquefied natural gas infrastructure. What we've seen since the beginning of the war and the sanctions against Russian oil and gas is that many European countries started thinking, okay, we might need to buy gas from other countries. And we also might need to build new infrastructure for liquefied natural gas, so LNG. This is, for example, what Germany is doing. And Germany was one of the main clients for Russian gas, main buyers for Russian gas. And there was also a lot of criticism of that, and there's still a lot of criticism of that. So, in a way, what we see the changing character of the energy market is that we, the environmentalists, people who are very much worried about climate change, we thought, okay, so the war in Ukraine shows us how bad and corrupt current global energy system is. What we have is a handful of producers of oil and gas. The rest of the world relies on them. And many of these producers actually are located in countries with very strange political regimes, like with one. So that would be a huge motivation for countries to actually go completely off fossil fuels and start developing renewable energy instead, very quickly. Unfortunately, we don't see now happening that quickly because you need a lot of money, you need a lot of technologies, you also need a lot of restructuring. What we see now is that many countries who used to be buying Russian oil and Russian gas go instead to the Gulf countries, go to Azerbaijan, go to Qatar, where the World Cup is currently taking place, and make new deals there, or trying to drill in Africa, right, as I mentioned before. We can only hope that this is a short-term consequence, and in the middle run and the long run, we will actually see a lot of development of renewable energy. It's actually continues to happen. There's a lot of investment going into wind and solar, and the three main regions which drive this investment is the European Union, the US, and China. They invest a lot in this. But still, in a way, the growth of consumption is still not in pace with the growth of new renewable energy capacities. Now, you may ask me, there's so many good stories in the European Union about development of renewable energy. So why is there still a problem with Russian gas? It's a very good question. And the answer would be that various kinds of fossil fuels are being used for various kinds of purposes. So oil is mainly used for vehicles, for transportation, cars. And as long as people buy new cars which drive on gasoline, we will need oil, and we'll need a lot of oil. So the way out of oil is mainly the transportation sector. Urban mobility, less private cars, more bicycles, more pedestrian infrastructure, possibly some electric cars, but they are also not an ideal solution. Coal and natural gas are mainly used for other purposes, and that is energy generation. And energy can come in the form of electricity, or it can come in the form of heating. And with electricity production, a few European Union countries did really well in terms of renewable energy. On certain days, countries like Germany or Spain, I don't have all the data about the Netherlands, but I know the case in Germany and Spain cover 100% of the electricity need by renewable energy. The Romanian issue is the heating for northern countries. And here the problem is that many cities have inbuilt infrastructure for delivering hot water in our radiators when it's hot or when it's cold. And to restructure the whole system takes a lot of time and a lot of money. And especially if it's a cold city, and especially if it's a city where 3 to 5 million people live, it's a huge task. So now there's a lot of thought about what do we do with our heating system for cold cities and cold regions of the world so that we go off gas. The technological solutions at the moment are once again either solar or the so-called heat pumps. For example, Sweden, Stockholm produces quite a lot of its heating from heat pumps. But heat pumps is still something rather costly, not what every city can allow to have. But I think once again, trying to put it into the more global perspective, I would also say that basically heating is something which concerns only a small proportion of people on this planet. Many people on this planet do not need heating. They need conditioning. The place I just come from, back from Egypt, is a good example of that. Another tricky sector where we still need a lot of gas in Europe, and the whole debate about gas, is the industry. Production of steel, production of cement, and production of many other materials which we have in our daily life around us, which we use a lot. If you just think about all the metals which are out here in this room. And a lot of it has been produced, if it has been produced in Europe, with gas. Now, the historic track is that a lot of metals and also other crucial materials, including construction materials like cement, have been produced with coal before. We all remember the so-called Martin stoves, right? I hope I'm translated correctly. And now, in many countries which went the way of environmental transformation, they came to the gas power in the stoves. The future is hydrogen. The future is hydrogen and possibly green hydrogen, hydrogen which is produced from renewable energy. And a number of steel producers are experimenting with it, but still, they're still not there. They're still not completely there. So gas is highly needed for production of metals. And that leads me also to another sector which we have not really spoken about. So we've spoken about climate agenda in general, we've spoken about energy sector being restructured. Now there's also the whole metal sector. There are many kinds of metals out there in the world. And there are many kinds of metals that we use in our daily life, from steel and aluminum to some rare metals and rare earth metals, which are crucial for energy transition. And the ones which I use in mobile phones, the ones which I use in wind mills to produce wind energy, the ones which I use in electrical cars. And here, once again, Ukraine halting production of quite a lot of metals, and Russian companies having sanctions against them, also reshaping the whole metal sector. From traditional metals, from like basic metals, including aluminum and steel is not a metal, but like a metal product, to metals like nickel or copper, which are also highly needed, or lithium, which are highly needed in the new economy. And at the UN Climate Conference, there was also a lot of talk about that. How many metals we need, where they're coming from, what is their track of record, and also can we actually bring down our consumption of metals. In late September, there was a very interesting new book published, and I strongly recommend you reading this book. It is actually available online for free. You can read it in an online form. The book is called Earth for All, and 4 is a figure, so Earth for All. It's a book which was written and published by a number of research institutions, including the Club of Rome. You remember they made the very first prognosis about the so-called limits of growth. How many people can have on Earth, how many resources we can consume. That was all back in 1972. So now there's a new book out. Global Rome, Stockholm Resilience Institute, Potsdam Institute for Climate Studies, all got together and wrote this book, about 400 pages, about where we are now. What's happening with the planet? What's happening with ecosystems? Have we lost some ecosystems forever? Are we using too many chemical pollutants? How much water do we have? Will there be enough water for 8 billion people? We have 8 billion people on the planet now. What about consumption of primary materials? This is a very interesting topic, and this is also something which is connected to the metal debate I was talking about. They give this very interesting data that global consumption of metals in the last 30 years have doubled. So now we use 2 times as many various metals as before. And the question now is how to use less of new metals and also materials including cement and other construction materials, and how to reuse the ones we already have, how to extract them from the objects which we don't use anymore and put them back into production cycle. Now here we're going to a new area, something which is called the circular economy, which is trying to see how we can integrate something which we would consider to be waste from one production stage or consumption stage and put it back into our circle of consumption and use less of the new and use more of the old. Once again, very much connected with the metal production, metal consumption, and greenhouse gas emissions, and also ultimately with the war in Russia and with the war in Ukraine, because a lot of metal production has been affected. And now probably the last comment before I would like to open up to your questions and your comments. I also was asked a lot about what was Russia talking about. Was Russia doing a climate conference? What was Russia's position? And Russia did have a delegation, the usual one. And actually quite a lot of Russian companies were present, and quite a lot of Russian companies were very vocal about how Russia still wants to remain part of the global climate debate, how Russia still wants to continue climate negotiations, how Russia still views environmental and climate topics as neutral topics, something where diplomacy can happen. So this is what Russia was saying. And I would say from my perception, the global community is split on this topic. There's one point of view which says, no, we cannot cooperate with Russia in current conditions, because Russia is the terrorist country, which holds a very lively war in Ukraine, and before the war stopped, we cannot do anything. But then there's also another opinion which says, no, global concerns are more important than the wars, and global concerns are more important than military conflicts. We all have to cooperate, and Russia is the largest country on earth in terms of the territory. And even if we can introduce sanctions against Russian economy, we cannot close Russia to the rest of the world. The forests will still be burning, Arctic will be melting, permafrost will be melting. We need to be getting data out of it. Now there's a lot of issues with international scientists not getting enough data about ecosystems in Russia, and Russian scientists not getting access to international databases. Like also the scientific cooperation has been influenced a lot by the direct sanctions or self-sanctions of many research institutions. And likewise, we cannot just close Russia. There should be some kind of climate cooperation. But I believe the answer is, what kind of climate cooperation can there be? Also with which actors? Is it the government? Are these independent scientists? Some companies? Civil society activists? Who could be the actors? That's still a very open question. That was I would say, still not clear. And if you speak about Russian companies and Russian businesses which were present at the UN Climate Conference, Rosatom, the state nuclear company, was very active. Well, in fact, Russia for years has been trying to push an idea that nuclear energy is a climate solution. Nuclear energy is good for solving climate crisis, and trying to promote its nuclear technologies worldwide. It should be said, it's not only Russia doing it, many other countries also support that. For example, the US is supporting the fact, and the UK, France, France, the UK, the US are also supporting this point of view. And this year, what Rosatom was doing, Rosatom was talking to a lot of, so to say, non-Western countries in trying to promote these technologies. Countries in Africa, countries in Asia, countries in Latin America. So this is also one track. Another track, a lot of Russian metal companies and also companies in the area of producing fertilizers were also talking a lot about how global cooperation is important. There were copper companies, there were nickel companies, they were saying, look, we understand current international conditions are like this, but the world needs nickel for electric cars. The world needs copper for wires and production of renewable energy. Let's continue the conversation. So they were saying it openly. Once again, there were mixed reactions to it. I would say mixed reactions. There were actually quite a number of protests that the activists did at the conference. For example, when Russia was holding its official side event, a group of Ukrainian activists stood up and made an action saying that Russia is actually killing people in Ukraine and is just making false climate claims, while in fact there's a lot of extra greenhouse gas emissions appearing because of the war. And likewise, there were many similar actions, and Russia was condemned by many activists. But still, especially at the UN level, you can also see the world is not united on that point. There are many countries in the world, also from the global south countries, which think, okay, there are other topics which are much more important than the one in Ukraine now, including food security, including energy security, including access to fertilizers, including access to metals. And this is once again, which makes the whole international picture a bit more complicated than probably we perceive it here in the Netherlands or here in Germany, where I'm based. Just the very last thought, maybe also just to show you another global and not very clear and not very expected consequence of the war in Ukraine. So with the issues and with the health problems of delivering grains and fertilizers from Russia and Ukraine, it has been solved to a certain extent through the grain deal, but still not completely fully. But yes, many other countries started thinking about producing actually more wheat and more fertilizers. And some of these countries are from South America, including Brazil and Argentina. And there, once again, the whole dispute is about, new chances. Okay, so we cut down more of the forest and we produce more wheat. We cut down more, we take more land from indigenous communities and we produce more potassium, which is needed for fertilizers. Once again, indirect consequence, very unexpected one, but it's also still something which is happening now. So in a way, it was good to see the newly elected president of Brazil, Lula, who came to COP and who said, look, we're gonna secure Amazon is with us, we're gonna secure that we do not violate that many rights of indigenous communities in Brazil. We'll try to do something, at least. But once again, war in Ukraine, direct environmental consequences, indirect consequences for climate, for energy, for food, and also for metals, or even for the Amazon. This is possibly shows how global and interconnected the world is, even after the pandemic, even with the war in Ukraine taking place, and also makes us think a lot. Well, at least made me think a lot. So, thank you.